Well, it's been a couple weeks since I've shared with you about the stories of Elisha. The last time we looked at Elisha, we looked at the siege of Samaria. Do you remember that story? How the Arameans came around the city of Samaria and they besieged it, and guess what happened? A famine took place in the city. The food was running low, and it forced terrible circumstances on the people, including, of which the scriptures talk about, the atrocity of two women fighting over the next child they were going to eat so they could stay alive. These stories are told not to question the goodness of God or why he isn't helping or doing something about the evil in our world. In fact, he's actually doing something, both through the prophet Elisha and the goodness of God-fearing people, as well as fulfilling the plan of salvation through Jesus, which will take place in about 800 years into the future from the stories of Elisha. Today, we dive deeper into another two stories. In the first, we will encounter an old acquaintance and supporter of Elisha, the Shunammite woman and her son. Do you remember the story of her son when he died and Elisha raised him back to life? We're going to be taking a look at this lady again. And in the second story, we're going to go back to the stories of the Arameans and how they plagued the northern nation of Israel. This time, with a bit of a regime change through an assassination. There aren't a lot of hidden secrets in these stories, but there is the ongoing goodness of God that permeates through the world, in the world, as it's entrenched in famine, suffering, and through murder. The horrors of war are brought to light. The lust for power continues to plague the human heart, and yet there is the witness of goodness and compassion through God's people that keeps infiltrating the wickedness of kingdoms and tyrants. This ongoing spiritual warfare is not just about demons. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 to 12, it says, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." In this text, there are a number of different powers listed, invisible powers. And depending on what they are and how they are used, they may not play nice. There's a commentator named Klein Snodgrass, and in his commentary, he warns and he counsels and he says, don't try to distinguish the difference between the spiritual powers in this text in Ephesians. It's a futile gesture and would stray within the realm of speculation rather than produce anything concrete and helpful. What we can know, though, in the realm of spiritual warfare is that these powers that are listed are used for evil, and we will struggle against them. Paul makes it clear how we do that with the armor of God and through prayer. Another author, Hendrikus Burkhoff, if you'd like to read his book sometime, it's titled Christ and the Powers. He writes about these powers and authorities and dominions and how they are used. It's not so simple to say that the evil forces in the world are just demons, fallen angels. That would be an erroneous statement. There is a lot more at work in our world and that they exist in the heavenly realms. And according to ancient cosmology, and I'm going to put a little map up there for you, they believe that something was in the sky, something was in the air. And if you take a look at this, in the ancient Near East, this is kind of how they believe that the world existed. So at the very top, you see that arc with some stars there. That is the firmament of rain, water above the world. Below that is the sky, and within the sky is the sun and the moon. And then below that is the earth. Below that, you'll see Sheol as that dark gray area, and below that, there are waters below the earth. And that's how they believe the earth existed. That's their cosmology, their theory, their theology of the world. And so when they talk about, and when Paul is talking about these forces in the heavenly realms, it's not talking about in heaven where God is seated. It's talking about in the sky. There's something in the air. And you know that you've experienced things like that before. How many of you have ever experienced mob mentality? Anybody? I don't necessarily want you to admit that you did anything wrong. That's not where I'm going with it. A mob mentality can easily be seen as one of those things where how is it that 1,000 people all of a sudden live life differently and get involved in a mob mentality and they would never do that on a normal day? I think that the German people in World War I, with the rise of Nazism after that, and throughout World War II, that the Christian German people can attest that there is something significant about Paul's confession, that there's something in the air. And I would encourage you, the author of this book experienced that. And I'd encourage you, read his book. There are things that happen in this world, and we don't understand why. Nations go one way, rulers go another way, and we wonder what's going on. Why are they fighting? Why are they trying to destroy the earth? Why are they trying to kill off an entire race? There are a number of different passages that we could read for consideration. And I'll have them up on the screen if you want to write them down or take a picture of them. These are the passages of Scripture that talk about the powers and dominions and authorities in the New Testament. Read about them. Consider them. These powers were created by Christ and for Christ. It might seem strange to think of them as in a positive sense, but we must remember what Paul was teaching throughout his letters, that the centrality and the supremacy of Christ is what's important. Jesus is Lord. He is Creator, and He created these powers that are in the air, how they affect nations and people. These powers are subservient to Jesus. They are meant to serve Him and His will. But we must remember that these powers are not the devil's invention. The devil cannot create anything. But yet, at times, he will use them. And as Berkhoff continues to say in his book, he says, therefore, the believer's combat is never to strive against the orders or these powers, but rather to battle for God's intention for them and against their corruption. And Paul, in his letter, tells us how we do that. We'll see within the stories of Elijah and Elisha that we can see principalities and powers that are at play within their nation and in the nation surrounding them, including in the false worship. How is it that an entire nation of Israel, who was saved by Yahweh, brought out of the land of Egypt, brought to the promised land, as a nation who committed themselves to being in a covenant with the Lord, turn away? How can they turn away? Our struggle as Christians, when we take a look at the atrocities that continue to happen in our world, and when we see that there's something in the air, our struggle is to make sure that we live according to God's intention, His goodness, and His commands. The armor of God is about living God's salvation, His righteousness, peace, truth, His word, and always through prayer. Notice how these armor of God, these pieces, have a lot to do with Jesus. Who is it that saves us? The helmet of salvation. It's Christ. Who is it that imparts His righteousness to us? Christ. Whose truth? Who is the truth? Jesus. Who is it that's the Prince of Peace with the shoes of peace? Jesus. Who is the living Word? Jesus. And we do all of these things. We live for Christ, and we do that also through prayer. And this means that whether it's the role of Elisha, who lived his life and had his hand as a prophet over 2,800 years ago, his role is actually quite similar to our role today. When we live in a dark world, we are to bring light, the light of God, wherever we go. It's through justice, love, mercy, compassion, all of which are to be done in the name of Jesus. the creator and Messiah of this world. So allow me to read to you the stories from 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 1 to 15, and take a look at what's happening there, and then we'll save some application ideas for a little later. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, "Go away with your family and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years." The woman proceeded to do as the man of God said. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to appeal to the king for her house and land. The king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and had said, "Tell me about all the great things Elisha has done." Just as Gehazi was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, the woman, whose son Elisha had brought back to life, came to appeal to the king for her house and land. Gehazi said, "This is the woman, my lord and king, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life." The king asked the woman about it, and she told him. Then he assigned an official to her case and said to him, "Give back everything that belonged to her, including all the income from her land from the day she left the country until now." Elisha went to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, was ill. When the king was told, "The man of God has come all the way up here," he said to Hazael, "Take a gift with you and go meet the man of God. Consult the Lord through him and ask him, 'Will I recover from this illness?'" Hazael went to meet Elisha, taking with him as a gift 40 camel loads of all the finest wares of Damascus. He went in and stood before him and said, "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to ask, 'Will I recover from this illness?'" Elisha answered, "Go and say to him, 'You will certainly recover.' Nevertheless, the Lord has revealed to me that he will in fact die." He stared at him with a fixed gaze until Hazael was embarrassed. Then the man of God began to weep. "Why is my Lord weeping?" asked Hazael. "Because I know the harm you will do to the Israelites," he answered. "You will set fire to their fortified places, kill their young men with the sword, dash their little children to the ground, and rip open their pregnant women." Hazael said, "How could your servant, a mere dog, accomplish such a feat?" "The Lord has shown me that you will become king of Aram," answered Elisha. Then Hazael left Elisha and returned to his master. And when Ben-Hadad asked, "What did Elisha say to you?" Hazael replied, "He told me that you would certainly recover." But the next day he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it over the king's face, so that he died. Then Hazael succeeded him as king. First point I want to make this morning is about the first story, not a coincidence. As we read, the story of the Shunammite woman and her son is embedded in yet another famine. We've looked at the stories of Elijah and Elisha. There's a lot of famines happening. If you take a look at the screen, there will be a map of the location where she left. And so you'll see over along the seaboard, on the southwestern seaboard, there is that red area where we would think of maybe the Gaza Strip being today. That's where she went. And that's where she and her family stayed for 7 years. The famine would have been localized to a particular region, which would have been in northern Israel at the very least, not across the entire ancient Near East world. However, I want us to notice how Elisha shows compassion to this lady and her family, warning her of the impending famine. This lady decided, as we read the story earlier, that she built a home, an extra place, a bedroom, if you will, for the man of God so that he can stay there in his travels. And so he would have gotten to know her and her son and her husband. And it is this family that they were showing compassion to. What we notice in this story is that this famine that's coming was decreed by the Lord, most likely because of the continued sin of Baal worship and idolatry in the nation. So in the midst of a tragic wake-up call to yet again warn the Israelites that they need to follow Yahweh and not Baal, God's compassion is seen through giving this lady and her family a warning to leave the area and live in a place where there's going to be food. However, it's not without its difficulties. Think about it. While she and her family were warned, and as we read in earlier stories that they were wealthy and well-connected, she and her family had to leave their home for 7 years. How would you like to do that? Take off 7 years because God told you to, and then come back. Now, sometimes God calls us to a particular place because God has something for us to do there. In this story, it's about what God is asking us to not stay in. He's trying to get us out of the way, or this lady out of the way, so that he can do something in the land as a wake-up call to the nation of Israel to tell them, stop following Baal. He doesn't exist. While the warning is for her and her family, some commentators believe that because her husband was old, and we see that back in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 14, Gehazi, the very guy who's in this story as well, mentioned that her husband was old. So he might not be alive at this moment. He might have passed away when they made their trip to the land of the Philistines, or he might have passed away when he was in the land of the Philistines during the 7 years, because when she comes back with her son, he's not mentioned, and nor does he do any of the talking. Because when they go before the king, it's her who does the talking, not him. So most likely he had passed away. Their land would have been held in trust by the kingdom, because they were gone for quite a long time, until they returned from their 7-year trip, and then they would hope that they can get their land back, which they should be able to. But this is where we're left with a huge gap in the nation of Israel. For 7 years, we don't hear anything about Elisha or the nation of Israel. It's 7 years of famine. That's all we know. We don't know about the crisis. We don't know about the hardships. We don't know what the people would have experienced. We don't know their crisis of faith even in that, because they served Baal. Baal was their god of fertility. For fertility for humans, for animals, and as well as for the land. We don't know anything that took place during that time. All we know is she came back after 7 years, and we're thrown into the present day in the story. Maybe this story is to remind us a little bit about the 7 years of famine in Egypt. We hear that echo, that God had a 7-year famine for them as well. But that number 7 is used in a biblical sense of a full amount of time, the perfect, completed amount of time that God wanted to have, in the hopes, as we would hope, that the nation of Israel would turn back to God. But this is where we get back to Elisha's present day. And look, the king is talking with Gehazi. Remember, Gehazi is the servant of Elisha, but remember what happened to Gehazi a couple stories ago? He got leprosy, right? He did something he wasn't supposed to. He went and lied and took money from an Aramean commander. And Gehazi received that man's leprosy. Anyways, he's still kicking around. And he's talking to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel is asking him about the stories of Elisha, about his miracles and his ministry. Now, was this conversation happening because of the futility of Baal and the king and the nation were finally coming to their senses? No idea. It doesn't say. But what we do know is that it is this exact moment when the Shunammite woman and her son walk in. Just as Gehazi was telling the king about how Elisha raises the dead, in walks the risen dead. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? The king had the land and the income from the land for 7 years given back to her. That's kind of a nice, welcome home gift. But notice that this is not a coincidence. It was the sovereign hand of God, his compassionate love, and his perfect timing. God's love can be seen even when life doesn't make sense, when the world is falling apart, and when evil keeps trying to rule the day. Perhaps we are supposed to notice the irony between the current king of Israel, Jehoram, and his father Ahab. Ahab and Jezebel had a man named Naboth killed so they could take his vineyard, which was near the palace in Jezreel. Here, his son is giving the land back to this lady. But before we jump into application, what can we learn and apply to our lives, let's look at the next story. Point number 2, I call it the death stare. Verse 7 to 15. The king of Aram is ill, and he's not sure he's going to make it. Anybody have a cold or a flu where you thought you weren't quite sure if you were going to make it? He was feeling that way. I don't know what he had, but he was not doing well. And lo and behold, Elisha was on his way there. I think he was on his way there because he had a job to do, and I'll point that out a little bit later. Elisha's infamy, his fame, spread across the nations for years upon years. Of all the things that he's done, he's helped out individuals as kings and as well as armies. The miracles that he's provided for people. And that's where the king sends Hazael with a large gift. And it mentions a very substantial gift. It's probably a hyperbole of some sort, to ask the prophet if he, the king, will recover. And this is where we need to put our memory hats back on. So I don't know if your memories are as shady as mine or easily forgetful like mine. But if we go back to 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 15, God told Elijah, not Elisha, Elijah, to anoint Hazael as king over Aram. You remember that prophecy? However, that did not happen through Elijah. His successor took care of it in this passage. I think that's one of the reasons why he was on his way there. There was something he needed to do. There was an anointing that needed to happen. The very man the king trusted with the message, am I going to get better, and a kingly gift, is the one who will become king through an assassination. In fact, the historical records confirm that Hazael did in fact become king over Aram. There was a couple other nations that went to war against him and eventually was defeated in 841 BC by Shalmaneser III, who was king over the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were on the rise in military might and power and eventually will conquer over the known world, including the northern kingdom of Israel. But that's not for a while later. So when Elisha gave word that the king will recover from his illness, he also gave word that the king will die. At first, it sounded like a contradiction, but that's not what was happening. There was this awkward death stare between Elisha and Hazael until Hazael felt awkward about it and is wondering, what's going on, and Elisha starts to cry. And Hazael is wondering what's going on. And it's because Elisha sees what Hazael will do to the land of Israel, the horrors that he will commit against the people of God. It is then that Elisha reveals to Hazael that he will cause the pain against Israel because he will become king of Aram. And so the prophecy that was revealed in Elijah's day is now going to be fulfilled in Elisha's. But here's the question, and this one is, I like some of these questions. They sometimes keep me up at night, sometimes I just let them go because coffee's more important. Did Hazael already plan to assassinate the king, or did Elisha put the thought in his head by announcing that he would be king? And Hazael knew the only way he would become king is by killing off the current king and taking the throne by force. There you go. Thought for the day. Have fun at lunchtime. If you're going for lunch with somebody, talk about it. Chicken or the egg. After this, Hazael and Elisha parted ways, and the message was brought back to the king that he was going to recover until the next day when Hazael assassinates him with a wet cloth and suffocates him. One of the things that I think you all see in the stories of Elijah and Elisha is that there's a lot of darkness in the world. In just this short period of time in a small little area of the known world, there's evil. And it's only one story amongst all of the other stories. And sometimes it is really easy to get brought low and brought down and depressed and worry because of the darkness in the world. In our dark world, the light of God shines. Now that spring is here, how many of you have gone outside and watched the thunderstorms roll in? Anybody? I love watching thunderstorms roll in. Thunderstorms are common this time of year, and we can watch the blackness of a storm approach. It hits with its wind, its thunder, lightning, rain, and hail, and then in time, as the blackness continues to pass over us, we see the brilliance of light peering at us on the horizon. Thunderstorms are a great image of what life is like when the international powers or other powers that are in the air that are unseen, natural disasters and all sorts of other destructive forces make their move, ruin lives, and change the world. Well, the Scriptures teach us that our struggle is not about people. Our struggle is against the usage of principalities and powers and dominions to create havoc. Our role is always to be living in the way of Jesus, and through prayer to be ready when any situation comes our way. Our permanent role is to promote Christ and His kingdom. Our readiness to follow Jesus is not the ability to know all things, but rather to be able to live by the power of the Spirit no matter what situation comes our way. To live by the fruit of the Spirit, to live in the confidence of the gospel, and to have unwavering faith that God is guiding and leading people to trust in Him. We can give the peace, or He can give the peace that passes all understanding. We can trust in Him with all of our hearts. We can know that He is the way, the truth, and the life. And it is this witness, our witness, about God and His love for His creation that can be a light when the storms rage onward. Brian Stewart, I don't know if you remember him. Some of you might. He was a journalist for over 40 years. And it was the force of Christianity and its drive to help others that struck him deeply during his career. And so from a journalist point of view, I want to read to you a speech that he wrote. And I'm going to only read part of it. He writes, "I'm no theologian. Forgive any blunders on that ground, but what has truly surprised me over many years is not the triumph of trends, which flicker and fade like shadows at summer twilight, but rather the survival of spiritual hunger. This spiritual hunger and a religious force field that springs from it is the human drive to serve and to help others. It's so very much greater than I had imagined. And I've seen it blaze forth in places far darker, more threatening than I could have imagined. The surprise, I suppose, was my surprise. For this force has been there, after all, from the very beginning of Christianity, and mysteriously seems never to weaken nor grow weary. But I do wish to tell you that something of what I have observed as a reporter, and have finally come to believe very deeply. For years, I've been struck by the rather blithe notion spread in many circles, including the media, and taken up by a rather large section of our younger population, that organized mainstream Christianity has been reduced to a musty, dimly lit backwater of contemporary life, a fading force. Well, I'm here to tell you, from what I've seen from my ringside seat at events over decades, that there is nothing further from the truth. I have found there is no movement or force closer to the raw truth of war, famines, crises, and the vast human predicament than organized Christianity in action. And there is no allegiance more determined and dogged in action than church workers, ordained and lay members, when mobilized for a common good. It is these Christians who are right on the front lines of committed humanity today. And when I want to find that front, I follow their trail. It is a vast front, stretching from the most impoverished reaches of the developing world to the hectic struggle to preserve caring values in our own towns and cities. I have never been able to reach these front lines without finding Christian volunteers already in the thick of it, mobilizing congregations that care, and being a faithful witness to truth, the primary light in the darkness, and so often the only light. Now, this is something the media and government officials rarely acknowledge, for religion confuses many, and anyway, we all like to blow our own horns. So frontline efforts of Christianity do not usually produce headlines, and unfortunately, this feeds the myth that the church just follows along to do its modest bit. Let me repeat, I have never reached a war zone or famine group or crisis anywhere where some church organization was not there long before me. Sturdy, remarkable souls, usually too kind to ask, "What took you so long?" I don't slight any of the hard work done by other religions or those powerful secular NGOs I've dealt with so much over the years. They work closely with the church efforts. They are noble allies. But no, so often in desperate areas, it is the Christian groups there first that labor heroically during the crisis and continue on long after all the media and visiting celebrities have left. Now, I came to this admiring view slowly and reluctantly. At the start of my career, I largely abandoned religion, for I, too, regarded the church as a rather tiresome irrelevance. What ultimately persuaded me otherwise, and I took a lot of persuading, was the reality of Christianity's mission, physically and in spirit, before my very eyes. It wasn't the attraction of great moments of grandeur, although I admit covering this pope, and at that time it was Pope John Paul II, on 6 of his early trips abroad, including his first one to Mexico and then epic returns to Poland, certainly shook any assumptions I had of Christianity as a fading force. No, the millions upon millions gathered was impressive, but I was more moved by quiet, individual moments of character and courage that seemed to be anchored in some deep core within Christianity. Whether it's Elisha helping out the Shunammite woman and her child, whether it's helping refugees from Ukraine, standing up for the sanctity of life in a culture that seeks to kill off its unborn or anyone who qualifies for a medical assistance in dying, helping out at a pregnancy care center, or providing food for those in our own community who have no money, our light as Christians shines because of the light and the love of God within us. It is persistent, it is powerful, it brings hope. As the worship team comes up now to prepare for our closing song, let me remind us here that we here at Crossfield Baptist Church are seeking God's will for our direction, His vision for our future, His call for our obedience, His gospel for our neighborhood. And we can have that dogged determination that we stand on the side of history with our Creator and Lord. So let us get rid of doubts and fears by walking in faith each day, unashamed to say the name of Jesus to those who need to hear it. Let us offer hope through word and deed and not stop until God calls us home. Make the rest of your days be dedicated to bringing the gospel to your corner of the world. Let the name of Jesus be remembered through the work and word of His holy church. And we can accomplish this by the power and the will of God, because God is faithful.